The day Louise Easton arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to watch her step down from the stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag, a lifted chin, and eyes that dared the whole frontier to try and break her. It was the spring of 1873, and Dusty Creek was the kind of town that ate gentle things alive. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, dragging with it gamblers and speculators, and men whose intentions were as crooked as a dry riverbed. The cattle drives had made a handful of ranchers wealthy, and everyone else sunburned and exhausted. There was a sheriff who spent more time at the saloon than at his own office, and a church whose congregation prayed on Sundays and sinned the remaining 6 days with remarkable dedication. Into all of this walked Louise Easton, 24 years old, recently widowed, and entirely alone. She had come from Missouri, from a town called Harlow's Bend, where she had spent 3 years married to a man named Gerald Easton who had promised her adventure and delivered her poverty instead. Gerald had not been cruel, only careless, and when a fever took him in the winter of 1872, Louise had sat beside his grave in the frozen ground and felt, alongside genuine grief, a terrible and guilty relief. She had sold what little they owned, packed her carpet bag, and pointed herself west because west was where a person went when they had nothing left to lose and everything still left to find. Dusty Creek was supposed to be a stop, not a destination, but the stagecoach driver, a round-faced man named Birch, had told her the next coach through wouldn't come for 2 weeks, and Louise had exactly $4.30 to her name. She needed work before she could afford to go any further. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mabel Prout, who had iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every possible variety of human foolishness, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She rented Louise a room on the 2nd floor that smelled of cedar and old wool, and she told her plainly that if she was looking for work, the hotel needed a cook, and the general store needed a clerk, and that was the extent of respectable employment for a woman in Dusty Creek. Louise chose the general store because she had always been quick with numbers, and she liked the idea of having a roof over her head that wasn't also a kitchen. Mr. Gable, the store owner, was a thin, anxious man who was perpetually behind on his inventory and deeply grateful to have someone organized enough to fix it. Louise started the following morning, and by the end of the first week, she had reorganized his entire shelving system, reconciled 6 months of muddled accounts, and arranged his dry goods in a manner that made the store feel almost pleasant to enter. It was in Mr. Gable's store, on a Thursday afternoon in the 2nd week of April, that she first laid eyes on Hugh Walden. She heard him before she saw him. His voice carried from the doorway like something natural and unhurried, the way a river carries without effort, and he was speaking to a younger man who was apparently his ranch hand, a boy of about 17 named Cody, about the correct way to select a bag of flour without squeezing it like you were trying to punish it for something. Louise turned from the shelf she was restocking, and for a moment her hands simply stopped what they were doing. Hugh Walden was tall without being imposing, broad in the shoulders in a way that came from real work and not from vanity, and he had the kind of face that the western sun had treated honestly, tanned and angular, and framed by dark hair that needed cutting and didn't seem to know it or care. He was perhaps 28, maybe 30, with a jaw that held a few days of beard and eyes that were a deep, particular shade of brown that she would later decide was the same color as the creeks looked in autumn, when the light came through the cottonwoods and hit the water just right. He wore a dusty gray coat and worn boots and a hat that had clearly survived significant weather, and he carried himself with the particular ease of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and had never felt the need to prove it to anyone. He caught her staring and did not make her feel foolish for it. He simply touched the brim of his hat and said, "Afternoon, ma'am," and then went back to correcting Cody on the flour situation. Louise went back to her shelves. But she was aware of him in a way she could not quite explain. The way you are aware of a fire in a room even when you are not looking directly at it. She learned about him from Mabel, who knew everything about everyone in Dusty Creek and offered this information freely as a kind of civic service. Hugh Walden owned the Broken Spur Ranch, about 6 miles southeast of town, a modest spread of a few hundred acres where he ran cattle and kept a small remuda of horses he was working to breed selectively. He had come to Dusty Creek about 4 years ago from somewhere further north, Colorado or possibly Wyoming. Mabel was not entirely certain, and he had built the ranch up from nothing with his own 2 hands and a stubbornness that apparently bordered on the legendary. He was quiet, Mabel said, but not unfriendly. He drank at the saloon occasionally but never to excess. He had been engaged once, years ago, to a young woman who had decided that ranch life was not what she wanted and had gone back east, and since then he had kept mostly to himself in matters of the heart. "He is a good man," Mabel said, in a tone that suggested this was not as common as it ought to be. Louise did not think much about this information, or at least she told herself she did not, but Hugh Walden kept coming into the store. He came in every week or so, which was reasonable enough since every rancher in the county needed supplies. But he had a habit of lingering near whichever shelf Louise happened to be working on, asking questions about the stock that she gradually suspected he already knew the answers to. He asked her once about the quality of the cornmeal, and they ended up talking for 20 minutes about the relative merits of different grinding methods, which was not a conversation Louise had ever imagined she would find herself having and enjoying as much as she did. She learned that he was thoughtful in the way that quiet people often are, that he had been reading a book about horse breeding that he was willing to admit had been mostly wrong, that he had a dry and almost invisible sense of humor that revealed itself in small ways and made her want to laugh more often than was probably dignified, and that he was genuinely curious about her, not in the invasive way of a man looking for entertainment, but in the careful way of someone who actually wanted to know. She told him a little, not everything. She told him she was from Missouri, that she was widowed, that she was saving money to continue west to Santa Fe, where she had a cousin who had written her about the possibilities there. She did not tell him about the guilty relief at Gerald's grave. She did not tell him how profoundly tired she was of arriving places and finding them not quite right. He listened to all of it with his hat in his hands and his eyes steady on her face, and he said, at the end, "Santa Fe is a fine place, but so is here." It was not a declaration of anything. It was simply an observation, but it sat with her for the rest of the day in a way she found difficult to shake. The trouble with Dusty Creek, as Louise had already begun to understand, was that it was not a peaceful place despite its ordinary surface. Underneath the routine of the cattle drives and the market days and the Sunday services, there were tensions running like fault lines through the community. The biggest source of those tensions was a man named Rance Collier. Rance Collier owned 3,000 acres to the north and east of town, the largest spread in the county, and he had built his empire through a combination of hard work, good luck, and methods that his neighbors described in careful, quiet voices when they were sure none of Collier's men were within earshot. He had a tendency to expand his fence lines in ways that happened to absorb smaller parcels of grazing land. He had a habit of making offers on neighboring properties that were low enough to be insulting, but came with an unspoken implication that declining might create inconveniences no one wanted to deal with. He had made an offer on the Broken Spur twice already. Hugh had declined both times. Louise heard about this from Cody, the young ranch hand, who came into the store one afternoon looking shaken and bought a peppermint stick he was clearly too old for and seemed to need anyway. He told her that 2 of the Broken Spur's fence lines had been cut the previous night, and 3 cattle had wandered off onto the road, and while nobody could prove it was Collier's doing, nobody had to prove it because everybody already knew. "Mr. Walden is not going to sell," Cody said, with a conviction that was part loyalty and part hope. "He has put too much into that land." Louise said she was sure things would work out, which was the kind of thing you said when you were not sure of anything but could not say so. She thought about it that evening in her room at the boarding house, listening to the wind come off the planes and rattle the window glass. She thought about Hugh Walden building something from nothing in ground that was trying to take it back. She thought about the way he had said so simply that here was a fine place too. She was not going to fall in love with a rancher in a troubled little Texas town. She had a plan. She had a cousin in Santa Fe. She had already survived one life that went sideways on her, and she was not about to build another on uncertain ground. She told herself all of this very clearly and went to sleep. And in the morning she was still in Dusty Creek, and Hugh Walden still made her heart behave in ways she found professionally inconvenient. The occasion that changed everything was the spring social, held in the first week of May at the town hall, which was a generous name for a large room above the feed merchant's warehouse. The whole community turned out because the winter had been long and people were hungry for something that wasn't survival. There was fiddle music and a caller for the dancing, and Mabel Prout brought her apple cake, which was the kind of thing people rode 20 miles to eat. Louise had not planned to dance. She had come because Mabel had invited her, and she did not want to seem ungrateful, and she sat at the edge of the room with a cup of cold cider and watched the dancers move in their rounds and felt pleasantly invisible. Then Hugh Walden appeared at her side with his hat already off, and he said, "I know this is probably not what you came here for, but would you do me the honor?" She looked at him. The fiddle was playing something fast and bright, and the lanterns overhead were making everyone look warm and golden, and Hugh was looking at her with that steadiness he had, that particular quality of attention that made her feel genuinely seen rather than merely observed. "I am not a very accomplished dancer," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "We will be bad at it together and hope no one notices." She laughed. She could not help it. She took his hand. They were not, in fact, very bad at it. He was not graceful exactly, but he was steady and he led with confidence, and he did not step on her feet, which she had experienced enough times in Missouri to consider a genuine achievement. They went around the floor twice, and by the end of the second pass she had stopped thinking about her feet and was simply moving with him, following the current of him the way you follow a river when you have stopped fighting it. When the music stopped they were standing close, her hand still in his, and the room was warm and loud around them, and for a moment it felt like they were in a small private pocket of quiet that belonged only to them. "You lied," she said. "You are not a bad dancer." "I have my moments," he said, and his eyes crinkled at the corners, and she felt that warmth spread through her chest like the first real heat of spring. They stayed together the rest of the evening. They talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are discovering that the conversation between them has no bottom. He told her about building the first structure on the broken spur, a rough linta that had collapsed in the first real storm, and that he had rebuilt 3 times before he understood what he was doing wrong. She told him about Gerald's failed attempt to start a feed business in Harlow's Bend, and how she had kept the books for him even when there was almost nothing in the books to keep, because at least the numbers made sense when everything else didn't. He listened to the story of her marriage with the kind of careful attention that didn't flinch from the difficult parts, and he didn't offer false comfort or tell her she had been blessed to have any of it. "You have been carrying a lot by yourself," he said simply. "Most people do," she said. "That doesn't mean they should have to." She had no answer for that. She looked away at the dancers and felt something move in her chest that was tender and a little frightening. He drove her back to the boarding house in his wagon that night, the plains enormous and dark on either side and the stars overhead performing their usual extravagance. They sat on the seat with a proper distance between them, which felt both correct and slightly ridiculous, and when they arrived at Mabel's gate, he helped her down from the wagon and held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Miss Easton," he said, "I would like to call on you if you are willing." She looked up at him in the darkness. His face was serious, but his eyes were asking something that went deeper than the formal words, asking if she was going to let anything real happen here, if she was going to keep Santa Fe in her pocket like a reason to leave. "I am willing," she said, and she meant it in all the ways it could be meant. He called on her the following Sunday, and they walked along the edge of the creek that ran south of town, and he told her more about the horses he was breeding, a particular bloodline he was trying to establish by crossing a Spanish Mustang mare he'd found wild in the hill country with a larger quarter-horse stud. He spoke about it with a passion that was quiet and deep, the way he spoke about everything that mattered to him, and she walked beside him and listened and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He came to the store through the week still, but differently now. Not pretending any more about the flour or the cornmeal, just stopping in to lean against the counter and talk to her for whatever time she could spare. And Mr. Gable would find reasons to be in the back room and pretend he wasn't grinning. On the third Sunday, sitting on a flat rock by the creek with their boots off and their feet in the cold water because the day had turned hot ahead of schedule, he told her about the Collier situation in full. He told it plainly, without drama, but she could hear the weight of it underneath the plain words. Collier had been pressuring him for 2 years. The fence cutting was escalating. 2 weeks ago, one of his cattle had been found shot, which could be disputed as coincidence but was not coincidence. He had gone to Sheriff Haynes about it, and Sheriff Haynes had written something in his ledger and done nothing further, which was consistent with his general approach to Collier-related complaints from smaller ranchers. "I am not going to sell," Hugh said. He was looking at the water, the light moving on its surface. "I know that probably sounds stubborn to someone from the outside." "It doesn't sound stubborn," Louise said. "It sounds like a man who built something and intends to keep it." He looked at her then. Something in his face shifted, something private becoming briefly visible. "Most people think I should just take the money and go," he said. "That I'm being foolish holding on. Most people's opinions are formed on what is easiest for them to believe," Louise said. "That doesn't make them right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Louise," and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss preceding it, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending out rings. "Yes," she said, though he hadn't asked anything yet. "I find myself wanting to ask you things I have no right to ask yet," he said. He said it carefully, like a man testing the weight of ice. "Things about whether you are still planning to go to Santa Fe." She had been thinking about Santa Fe less and less. She was aware of this. She had noticed that the cousin's letter, which she kept in the small inner pocket of her carpet bag, had gone unopened and reread fewer times with each week that passed. "I am finding that Santa Fe is losing some of its urgency," she said carefully. He turned to look at her then fully, and the afternoon light was doing something extraordinary with the water behind him, and he said, very quietly, "I am glad to hear it." They sat there for a long time after that, not saying much, the creek going past them and the plains humming in the heat, and she thought that this was what people meant when they talked about belonging somewhere. Not the place exactly, but the person you were sitting next to in it. The Collier trouble came to a head in early June, faster and harder than anyone had expected. It began with a visit. Rance Collier himself rode up to the broken spur one morning, while Hugh and Cody were working a new stretch of fence on the south pasture. Collier was a large, ruddy-faced man in his 50s who dressed better than the country around him, and carried himself with the assurance of someone who had never had a door closed in his face that he hadn't subsequently walked through anyway. He had 2 of his riders with him, which was both unnecessary for a conversation and not accidental. He made his third offer on the broken spur. It was slightly better than the second, which was damning by faint praise. He presented it as generosity. Hugh said no. Collier looked at him for a long moment, and then he smiled in a way that had nothing friendly in it, and he said that he hoped Hugh would reconsider before circumstances made the decision for him, and then he rode away. Cody told Louise about it when he came in for supplies the next day. His young face was tight with worry. "It's the way Collier said it," he said. like he already knows what the circumstances are going to be. Louise felt cold despite the warmth of the afternoon. She spent the rest of the day doing figures in her head and coming to no comfortable conclusions. 2 days later, there was a fire. It started in the night in the small hay barn at the eastern edge of the Broken Spur property. Hugh smelled it before he heard it, woke from a dead sleep with the smell of smoke already in the air, and he and Cody managed to pull most of the horses clear of the pasture before the barn was fully involved. The hay was lost, $200 worth of winter feed, and the structure was a blackened frame by morning. There was no proof. There was never any proof. Hugh rode into Dusty Creek the next morning looking like a man who had not slept, and had made some very serious decisions while not sleeping. He came to the store, which was not yet open, and knocked on the side door that led to the stockroom where Louise had taken to doing her morning accounting before the business day started. She opened the door and looked at him, and she could read the whole night in his face, the ash on his coat, the tightness around his eyes, the particular kind of exhaustion that is not physical. "Come in," she said. She did not ask questions. She put coffee on the small stove in the corner of the stockroom and found the last of the biscuits Mabel had sent with her that morning, and she sat across from him at the small work table and waited. He told her. All of it. The fire, the horses, the lost hay, the cold calculation he could feel behind it all. His voice was level, but she could hear what it was costing him to keep it that way. "What are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. "I need to find someone in the county who can actually enforce the law," he said. "Haynes is useless, but there's a federal marshal who comes through the Eastern Circuit, a man named Pryor. He is supposed to be in Abilene within the next few weeks. I am thinking about riding to meet him." "That is a 3-day ride," Louise said. "Yes, that leaves Cody alone at the ranch." "I know," she thought about this. She thought about Cody's 17-year-old face and its tight, worried look, and she thought about Collier's men, and she thought about what she was and was not willing to stand by and watch happen. "Let me stay at the ranch while you are gone," she said. Hugh looked at her. "Louise." "I am not helpless," she said. "I can handle a rifle. My father taught me before I was 12 years old, and I have not forgotten. Cody should not be there alone, and you know it." "It is not about whether you can handle yourself," he said carefully. "It is about what people will say." "People can say what they like," she said. "People's opinions are formed on what is easiest for them to believe, and I believe I have made my own views on that subject clear." He almost smiled. It was small and tired, but it was real. "You quoted yourself at me. It bears repeating." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through his objections and finding them insufficient, not because they didn't exist, but because he could see she had already made up her mind, and because she thought he was the kind of man who had enough respect for a woman's mind to let her use it. "Mabel would have to know," he said finally. "It would have to be above board." "Mabel will understand," Louise said. "She is practical." "All right," he said, and then quieter, "Thank you." She reached across the small table and put her hand over his for just a moment, the way you touch something you want to be sure is real, and she felt his hand turn under hers and his fingers close briefly around her own. "Go see your marshal," she said. "We will be here when you get back." She told Mabel that evening, and Mabel was indeed practical, though she also raised one iron-gray eyebrow to a height that communicated a great deal without a word. She gave Louise a wrapped parcel of food and her own Spencer carbine, which she had kept since her late husband bought it in 1868, and which she maintained on principle, and she said, "Tell that young man to be careful." Louise rode out to the Broken Spur the morning Hugh left for Abilene. She arrived at the ranch yard just as he was saddling his horse, a big roan gelding he called Drum, and she sat in her borrowed saddle and watched him prepare for the road, and felt the first real pang of something she was not yet ready to call by its right name. He came to her before he mounted. He stood beside her horse and looked up at her, and the morning was clear and young, and the plains beyond the ranch house smelled of grass and distance. "I will be back in 5 days," he said. "Maybe 6. "I know," she said. If anything happens, if Collier's men give any trouble, do not try to handle it yourself. Take Cody and ride to town." "All right," she said, though she reserved the right to use her own judgment about the definition of trouble. He put his hand on her saddle horn near her knee, and he looked at her with those Autumn Creek eyes, and he said, "When I get back, I have something I want to say to you." Her heart moved in a slow, serious way. "Then you had better come back quickly," she said. He smiled, fully this time, the kind of smile she had been collecting and keeping safe. He mounted Drum and rode out of the yard, and she watched him go until the dust of the road swallowed him, and then she turned to find Cody standing in the barn doorway looking both grateful and slightly overwhelmed to have company. "Right," she said. "Show me around the place." She spent 5 days at the Broken Spur, and in those 5 days she fell in love with it. Not romantically, not the way she was falling in love with its owner, but in the quiet, specific way that you fall in love with a place that has been shaped by the care of someone who genuinely loved it. The house was simple, but it was not rough. Hugh had built the furniture himself, solid and plain, and there were small details everywhere that spoke of a man who lived deliberately. A shelf of books above the fireplace, a coffee tin that he apparently kept full at all times, a window in the main room that faced east to catch the morning light. The horses in the pasture were the most beautiful she had ever seen, half wild and full of character, and they came to the fence when she walked by and watched her with an intelligence that she found almost uncanny. Cody was good company. He was young and earnest and talked about horses with the same seriousness that Hugh did, which she supposed was where he had learned it, and he ate everything she cooked with a gratitude that was endearing. He told her more about Hugh, the way young men talk about the people they most admire, with a mixture of reverence and affection that was entirely innocent. He told her about the time Hugh had ridden 20 miles in a February ice storm to pull a neighbor's cattle out of a frozen creek, and about how Hugh had taught him to read better than he ever had in school, and about how, when Cody's own father had drunk himself into uselessness 3 years ago, it had been Hugh who had given him steady work and a purpose. "He is the best man I know," Cody said simply, and then looked slightly embarrassed to have said it. "Yes," Louise said. "I think he probably is." Collier's men appeared on the 4th day. There were 2 of them, riding along the eastern fence line in the late afternoon, and they made no effort to disguise their presence or their purpose, which was to be seen and to make Cody nervous. They rode slowly, looking at the fence posts with studied interest, and one of them stopped at the point where the new fence joined the old and appeared to examine the wire very closely. Louise was at the fence line before she had quite decided to go there, Mabel's Spencer carbine in her hands, not raised but held with a purposefulness that was legible. "That fence is posted property," she said, in a voice that she kept level and clear. "I would appreciate it if you gentlemen moved along." The 2 men looked at her. One of them, a heavy-set man with a beard like dead grass, looked amused. The other, younger and less sure of himself, looked at the carbine and then at the first man. "And who might you be?" the heavy-set man asked. "Someone standing on the Broken Spur side of that fence," Louise said, "which is all you need to know. Move along." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be deliberate, and then the heavy-set man shrugged and the 2 of them rode away west along the fence line, unhurried, sending back a message of their own about what they thought of her authority. But they went. Cody let out a breath behind her. "That was something," he said. "That was nothing," Louise said, though her hands were not entirely steady as she lowered the rifle. "Let's go check the other fence lines." Hugh arrived back on the 6th day, just before noon, Drum moving with the particular tiredness of a horse that had been well ridden and knew home was close. Louise was in the yard when he came in, hanging the washing on the line she'd strung between the house and the water pump, and she watched him ride in and felt something so simple and complete move through her that there was no room for complication. He swung down from the saddle and his eyes found her immediately, and he stood there for a moment with the reins in his hand just looking at her, and she thought, with the washing still half done and the plains going on forever behind them and the horses watching from the pasture, that she had never seen anything as purely welcome as the sight of him coming home. "Marshal Pryor is coming to Dusty Creek in 3 weeks," he said. "He will look at the evidence, all of it." "Good," she said. "Cody told me about Collier's men. It was nothing dramatic," she said. "He said you took a rifle to the fence line alone." "I was not alone. Cody was there." Hugh looked at her for another moment, and then he walked across the yard and did something she had not expected. He put both hands on her face, very gently, and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind that had been waiting a long time to happen and knew it and was not embarrassed about it. It was warm and certain, and it tasted like the long road home, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart going at the same pace as hers, which seemed like the best kind of evidence. When they separated, he still had his hands on her face, and he was looking at her with the directness that had always undone her, and he said, "I told you I had something to say when I got back." "You did say that," she agreed. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I love you, Louise," he said. "It was not elaborate. It was just true. I have been trying to say it carefully for months, and I have decided that carefully is taking too long." She looked at him in the warm noon light, at this man who had built something real in hard country and was still standing in it, who had made a home out of stubbornness and care and quiet intention, who had looked at her from the beginning like she was worth the looking. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for some time, and I seem to be very bad at it." He laughed, full and real, and pulled her against him, and she stood in the circle of his arms in the yard of the broken spur with the horses watching and the plains shining in the midday sun, and felt, with absolute conviction, that Santa Fe could keep itself. The 3 weeks before Marshal Pryor's arrival were the best and worst of them. Best because Hugh and Louise were no longer navigating around what was between them, and the relief of it was extraordinary, like setting down something heavy you had forgotten you were carrying. He came into town every few days, and she came out to the ranch when she could borrow a horse, and they spent their time together with the ease of people who have stopped performing for each other and started simply being. He introduced her to the horses formally, each one by name. The Mustang mare he called Mesa, and the quarter horse stud named Cannon, and the various offspring of previous seasons. And she learned quickly that each horse had a personality as distinct as a person's, and she found that she loved them the way she had come to love the ranch itself, specifically and without reservation. He read to her from his books in the evenings on the porch, which she found quietly wonderful, his voice unhurried in the falling dusk, the coyotes starting up somewhere out on the flats as the light went. She brought him things from town, a new book she had ordered through Mr. Gable's catalog, a jar of the preserved peaches that Mabel made, once a somewhat battered journal she found at the back of the store's shelf and thought he might use for the breeding records he kept on loose scraps of paper he was always losing. He looked at the journal for a long time and then looked at her and said, "You pay attention." "I have been paying attention to you specifically," she said, "for quite some time." "I know," he said, and his voice was warm with it. But the worst of those 3 weeks was the Collier pressure, which did not abate. There was another fence cutting, and a report of someone running cattle through the south pasture at night, scattering Hugh's herd. Hugh and Cody rode a great deal and slept less than was healthy, and Louise could see the strain of it in the set of his shoulders, and the way his jaw tightened when something new went wrong. She went to see Sheriff Haynes herself, which was not something she had planned but which became inevitable one afternoon when she walked past his office, and the door was open and she could see him reading a newspaper. She sat down across from his desk and told him plainly what was happening at the broken spur, and what she believed the source of it was, and what she thought his responsibility in the matter was. She said all of this in the same level, clear voice she had used at the fence line, the voice she had discovered she possessed somewhere between Missouri and Texas, and which surprised her slightly every time she used it. Haynes was uncomfortable throughout this conversation. He was not a dishonest man exactly, she decided, just a weak one, a man who had taken the path of least resistance so many times that it had become the only path he knew. He said what she expected, that he couldn't make accusations without proof, that these things were sometimes just bad luck on a working ranch, that Rance Collier was a man of standing in the community. Rance Collier is a man with money, Louise said. Those are not the same thing as standing. Marshal Pryor will be here within the week. I would suggest that when he arrives, you be in a position to have been useful. She left before he could find anything to say to that. Mabel, when Louise reported this conversation over supper, nodded with the satisfaction of someone watching a pupil exceed expectations. "You are going to be a great deal of trouble to a great many men who deserve it," she said, which was the finest compliment Louise had received in some time. Marshal Pryor arrived on a Tuesday, a lean, weathered man of about 50, who moved with the economy of someone who had spent 30 years making every action count. He met with Hugh, and then with Sheriff Haynes, and then, Louise heard secondhand, had a conversation with Rance Collier himself that was described by the man at the feed merchants who had an adjacent office as very quiet and very pointed. There was no dramatic confrontation. That was not how these things worked in practice. She was learning. What happened instead was a series of quieter events. Pryor's investigation confirmed what everyone already knew but now had a federal officer's attention on it. Collier, faced with a level of scrutiny he hadn't anticipated, began to recalibrate. 2 of his riders left town without explanation. The fence cutting stopped. The running of cattle at night stopped. A week after Pryor's departure, Collier sent a message to Hugh through an intermediary, a local businessman who was clearly embarrassed to be playing the role, proposing a formal boundary survey and an agreement about the disputed fence lines. Hugh came to the store to tell Louise about it and found her in the middle of helping Mr. Gable inventory a new shipment, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and told her, and she set down her ledger and crossed the room and took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers in the ranch yard, and she kissed him there in the middle of Mr. Gable's store while Mr. Gable found something very important to examine in the back room. "Is it over?" she asked against his mouth. "The immediate trouble is over," he said. "Collier is not going to change his nature, but I think he has decided the broken spur is more trouble than it is worth." "Good," she said, "because it is not going anywhere." He put his hands over hers where they rested on his face, and he said, "Neither are you, I hope." She looked at him. The summer light was coming through the store's front window, and it was warm and ordinary, and she had never felt so certain of anything. "Ask me properly," she said. He laughed. Then, still holding her hands and looking at her with all that steadiness that she had been collecting and treasuring since the first afternoon he had walked through that door, he said, "Louise Easton, will you do me the very great honor of marrying me and helping me build something in this country that is worth the building?" "Yes," she said, simply, completely, with her whole self. "Yes, I will." They were married in September of 1873, on a clear blue Saturday that was warm enough for the door of the church to stand open and let the planes in. Mabel Prout stood up for Louise, and Cody stood up for Hugh, and the whole of Dusty Creek turned out because even the people who barely knew them understood that this was the kind of wedding worth witnessing. The minister, a young man of about 30 who had come to Dusty Creek 6 months earlier and was still slightly surprised to find himself in Texas, did a fine job and only wept once, which everyone agreed was appropriate. Louise wore a dress that Mabel had helped her make from ivory muslin, simple and practical in the way she liked things, with a small spray of wild verbena from the creek bank pinned at her collar. Hugh wore his best coat, which had been brushed until it no longer looked like it had opinions about the weather, and he stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him with an expression on his face that Mabel would describe for years afterward as the most honest thing she had ever seen on a man. When it was done and they stepped out of the church into the September afternoon, The whole congregation lined the path with hats raised and voices raised alongside them, and Hugh looked at Louise with the ring on her hand and the verbena in her hair and the blue sky over everything, and he said, very quietly just for her, "Hello, Mrs. Walden." She felt it down to her boots. "Hello, husband," she said. They had a celebration in the town hall, which again performed its role admirably, and there was fiddle music and Mabel's apple cake, and enough good feeling to light the whole county for a season. Mr. Gable gave a toast that was genuinely touching and only slightly long. Cody danced with a girl named Annie Briggs, who lived on the next property over, and had apparently been trying to catch his attention for months, and Louise noticed this with a satisfaction that she kept to herself. The drive back to the Broken Spur that evening, just the two of them in the wagon with the wedding behind them and the stars coming out overhead, was one of those stretches of time that seems to exist outside of regular time, protected from the usual rushing on of things. They sat close on the wagon seat, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her, the horses finding their own way home in the dark. "Are you afraid?" he asked at some point. "Of what?" she asked. "Of all of it," he said. "The ranch, the life here, what we are taking on together." She thought about it honestly. "I am not afraid," she said. "I am awake. That is different." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "Yes," he said. "It is." The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that winters always were in that country, cold and wind-bitten and long, with cattle to be checked on, and pipes that wanted to freeze and firewood that never lasted quite as long as you expected it to. But it was also good in the specific way of a first winter with someone, the learning of another person's habits and rhythms in the particular intimacy of a house that is yours together. She learned that he woke before dawn naturally, and liked to have the kitchen warm before she came down. She learned that he was a careful and thorough man in everything he did, not slow but deliberate, and that this quality was expressed in how he mended things, and how he planned for the spring, and how he touched her, with the same careful, full attention that he gave to everything he cared about. She learned that he did not sleep easily when something was worrying him, and that the way to reach him in those nights was not to ask questions but to simply be present, which she learned to do without fanfare. He learned that she kept her counsel until she had finished thinking, and then expressed it with a completeness that made further discussion largely academic. He learned that she had opinions about horses that were turning out to be well-founded, and that she was capable of looking at a problem from an angle he hadn't considered, and that this was useful more often than it was anything else. He learned that she cried sometimes, quietly, alone, about Gerald, about the life in Missouri, about the women she had been before she became who she was here, and that what she needed was not to be pulled away from this grief, but to have someone who would sit near it without flinching. And he did this the way he did all the important things, without ceremony and without fail. By the spring of 1874, the Broken Spur had a new fence line properly surveyed and recorded with the county, 3 new foals from Mesa and 2 of her crossbred daughters, and a vegetable garden of Louise's making that ran along the south side of the house and produced, by summer, enough to put up a serious amount of food for the following winter. She had stopped working at Gable's store, which had been a practical necessity and also a small grief, because she had liked Mr. Gable, and she had liked the counting and the order of the numbers. But the ranch needed her in ways that were larger than a part-time position at a general store, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was good at the ranch in ways that complemented Hugh's particular strengths. She kept the breeding records with a thoroughness that made Hugh's previous loose scraps of paper system look like what it was, and she negotiated the sale of 2 of the crossbred horses to a buyer in San Antonio in a way that got them a better price than Hugh had expected to ask. "You are frightening," he told her with admiration. "I have always been good with numbers," she said mildly. The Broken Spur's horses were developing a reputation. The combination of the Mustang's hardiness and the quarter horse's strength was producing animals that were sought after by cattlemen for trail work, responsive and sturdy, and with the kind of deep-water calm that the Mustang blood gave them. Hugh sold 4 of that season's foals and had requests for more. He started talking about adding a small second pasture for the breeding operation, and Louise started running the numbers on what it would take and whether they could do it by spring. They were sitting at the kitchen table in the late evening, her with her ledger and him with his coffee, when he looked up from whatever he was thinking and said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him across the table. The lamp was low between them, and outside the wind was doing its night rounds of the plains, and the house was warm and theirs. "I'm the happiest I have ever been," she said. Not performed, not poetic, just accurate. He reached across the table and closed his hand over her wrist. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In the autumn of 1874, Louise found out she was carrying a child. She told Hugh on a Sunday morning while he was at the barn, coming to find him with her heart going faster than usual and her face doing something she could not quite control. He was forking hay for the horses, and he turned when he heard her, and whatever was on her face made him set the fork down immediately and come to her. She told him plainly, because plainly was how she said things. He stood very still for a moment. Then he put his arms around her and held her against him with a care that was also a kind of fierceness, and she could feel, against her hair, the particular quality of his breathing, which was the breathing of a man who is trying very hard not to let his emotions run ahead of him and is not entirely succeeding. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very much all right," she said. "I am rather extraordinarily all right." He pulled back and looked at her, and his eyes were bright and his face was open in the way it was only with her, all the self-containment gone, just him, just this. "A baby," he said, as if he needed to say it to make it real. "A baby," she confirmed. "Sometime in the spring, I think." He put his hand very gently against her middle, where there was nothing yet to feel, and she put her hand over his, and they stood together in the barn with the horses watching and the October light coming through the slats in the wall, and she thought that the heart could hold more than you expected it to if you let it. Mabel Prout, when told, produced a quantity of preserved wisdom about pregnancy that was simultaneously alarming and useful, and immediately began knitting. Mr. Gable sent a note of congratulations, and a wrapped parcel of peppermint that he seemed to believe was universally helpful in difficult circumstances. Cody, who had grown considerably in the past year in both height and confidence, shook Hugh's hand with a seriousness that was so overdone it was charming, and then looked at Louise with an expression of genuine, transparent joy. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was something Louise endured rather than enjoyed. She was more tired than she had expected to be, and she had a period in the early months when the smell of coffee, which had previously been one of her great pleasures, made her want to leave the room immediately. Hugh gave up making coffee in the kitchen for 3 weeks and drank it at the barn instead, which she thought was one of the most loving things she had ever witnessed. He was extraordinarily gentle with her, not coddling her, because she would not have tolerated coddling, but present, thoughtful, anticipating what she needed before she needed it in the way he had always been, but now with an added tenderness that she found she did not mind at all. They talked about the baby endlessly, in the way of expectant parents, and they talked about names and about what they wanted for this person who was not yet a person in any visible way but was already entirely real. Hugh wanted a boy with the unself-conscious honesty of a man who had never had to apologize for wanting things. Louise wanted a healthy child and would negotiate on the rest. "If it is a boy," Hugh said one evening, "I was thinking Thomas, my father's name." "Thomas Walden," Louise said, testing it. "Yes, I like that." "And if it is a girl," she thought. "Clara," she said. "My mother's sister was Clara. She was the best person I have ever known who was not you." He looked at her when she said the last part, and his face did what it did. Thomas Hugh Walden arrived on a Thursday in late April of 1875, during a thunderstorm that seemed excessive to everyone present except Thomas himself, who was apparently unimpressed by weather, and screamed with a conviction that the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Hartley, described as a very promising sign. He was red and furious and perfect, and when Hugh held him for the first time, standing by the bed with the rain still going on the window, Louise watched his face, and she thought she would carry that moment inside her for the rest of her life. The careful, stunned, wholly undefended love on the face of a man who had always known how to love things but had perhaps never been so completely ambushed by it. Thomas was a determined baby who became a determined small child with his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which was a combination that kept everyone on their toes. He was fearless around the horses, which both terrified Louise and secretly delighted her, and Hugh began teaching him the basics of handling them before most children would have been considered ready, because Thomas did not particularly wait to be considered ready for things. The years that followed were full in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because no years were without difficulty in that country, but full of the specific richness that comes from building something together with someone you choose every day. The breeding operation grew. By 1876, they had a proper second pasture and a waiting list for the following season's foals, and the Walden horses were known across 3 counties for their quality. Hugh hired a second ranch hand, a quiet man named Eli who had come up from the south and who proved to be extraordinarily gifted with the more difficult horses, gentling them with a patience that even Hugh admired. Louise expanded her kitchen garden, and then, in the autumn of 1876, started a second project that she had been thinking about for some time. There were women in and around Dusty Creek, younger women and some not so young, who needed work and who had no useful path to it in the limited employment a small town offered. Louise began, quietly at first and then with more organization, to match these women with the households and small businesses that needed help, and to ensure that the arrangements made were fair ones. It was not a formal enterprise. She had no office and no title, but it was known, and women came to her, and she helped where she could. She thought of it as something her father would have recognized, practical charity, the kind that left people with their dignity intact. Mabel watched all of this with approval and increasingly poor health, and in the spring of 1877, when it became clear that Mabel was not going to recover from the illness that had settled in her chest over the winter, Louise was with her. She held Mabel's hand in the gray spring light of the boarding house room, and she was grateful, with the fullness of adult gratitude, for this woman who had given her a room and a carbine, and the kind of frank, bracing company that had helped her find her footing in a new country. Mabel died on an April morning with the window open and the smell of the plains coming in, and Louise grieved her genuinely and completely, and then carried her forward in the ways that mattered, in the iron-gray practicality and the fierce, quiet care for other people that Mabel had modeled so exactly. Hugh held her through that grief the way he held her through all of it, steadily and without fuss, present in the particular way that was his own. In the summer of 1877, Cody married Annie Briggs in the same church where Hugh and Louise had married, and Hugh and Louise sat in the front pew and watched these 2 young people, both now 21, make their own beginning. And she thought about how much had happened since that spring social where Cody had eaten a peppermint stick and looked worried, and she felt the particular warmth of watching people you love step into their own happiness. The matter of Rance Collier resolved itself in 1878, in the way that human nature sometimes resolves things without dramatic intervention. Collier, who had never stopped acquiring land by whatever means were available, finally went too far in an adjacent county and came up against a rancher who was better connected and more litigious than anyone he had previously encountered. The resulting legal dispute took 3 years and most of Collier's resources, and at the end of it, he sold his Dusty Creek holdings and moved east, and the county exhaled a breath it had been holding for a decade. Hugh heard about it from the man at the land office and told Louise over supper, and she set down her fork and looked at him across the table, which now had Thomas at one end of it talking about a lizard he had found with a thoroughness that the lizard probably didn't warrant. "Is that over then?" she said. "It appears to be," Hugh said. She nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Just good." He was smiling slightly. "Very good," she said. Quietly, finally, very good. Thomas looked up from his lizard narrative, sensing something significant. "What is very good?" he asked. "The world," Louise said. "On balance." Thomas considered this and found it satisfactory and went back to the lizard. By 1879, the Broken Spur was a different kind of operation than the modest, struggling ranch Hugh had been fighting to hold in 1873. The horse breeding had become the center of it, recognized enough that buyers came to them now rather than the other way around. The cattle were fewer but better managed. The property itself was shaped by years of intentional work. The fences straight and solid. The pastures rotated and rested in the way Hugh had read about, and Louise had helped him organize into a proper schedule. The house added onto with a new room that Thomas had immediately claimed, and a porch that ran the full length of the south side where the light was best in the evenings. It was on that porch, on a September evening in 1879, 6 years after they had married in the church in Dusty Creek, that Louise sat with Hugh in the last of the autumn light and watched Thomas, now 4 years old, conduct some elaborate private drama in the yard involving 3 sticks and a great deal of narration. The plains beyond the fence were gold in the low sun, and the horses were moving slow and easy in the pasture, and it was the kind of evening that had no particular significance on any calendar, but that she knew, even as it happened, she would remember for the rest of her life. She was carrying their second child. She had told Hugh that morning, and he had held her with the same careful fierceness as the first time, though this time his face also held a knowledge that the first time had not given him, the knowledge of exactly what this meant, all of it, the exhaustion and the fear and the overwhelming specific love, and he had looked at her with a gratitude that had no edges. "How are you feeling?" he asked now. "Like someone who is very glad to be here," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. Thomas, in the yard, had apparently resolved the drama with the 3 sticks and was now looking at the horses with his father's evaluating eyes. "Hugh," she said. "Yes, do you know what I think about sometimes? Tell me." "The stagecoach," she said. "The day I arrived, that sky." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember the day you arrived," he said. "I was not there to see it, but I heard about it. I heard about the woman who stepped off the stage with a carpet bag and a chin like she was daring the whole county." She laughed. "Mabel said something like that." "She was not wrong," he said. "I thought about it after we met. I thought about how close it was. You said you were going to Santa Fe." "I was going to Santa Fe," she said, "and instead." "And instead," she said, and looked at him, at this face that she knew now in all its lights and weathers, the early morning face and the exhausted face and the laughing face and the face he made when something moved him, and he was trying not to let it show too much, all of it hers in the way of things truly known. "And instead I found this. I found you." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old-fashioned and entirely sincere, and she felt it all the way through her, this life they had made, this particular version of the world with him at the center of it. "I love you," he said, not as a statement of something new but as an acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time and would go on being true in the way of deep country things, the creeks and the grasses and the plains themselves, continuous and real beneath everything. "I love you," she said, equally. Thomas appeared at the porch steps, done with the yard drama, looking at them with the frank assessment of a small child who is not yet embarrassed by his parents' affection for each other. "Can I have some water?" he asked. "Of course," Louise said, and rose, and Hugh rose too, and they went inside together into the warm and ordinary light of their home. Clara Me Walden arrived the following spring, in March of 1880, on a morning that was all wind and pale blue sky, and she was quieter than her brother at the outset but made up for it quickly, developing by 6 months an absolute clarity about what she wanted and a very effective method of communicating it. Thomas, after a brief period of uncertainty about his position, decided that a sister was acceptable and appointed himself her primary educator in the matter of horses, which Louise thought showed both good judgment and somewhat premature ambition, given that Clara was not yet walking. Hugh held Clara with the same care he had held Thomas, but there was something different in it too, the ease of a man who had held a newborn before and knew now that the terror was manageable. And he looked at his daughter's face with the same complete, helpless love that Louise had first seen on him in the thunderstorm 6 years ago, and which had not diminished in any direction. "Hello, Clara," he said softly, and she looked up at him with the unfocused, serious gaze of the very new, and he was entirely undone in the best possible way. The years settled into themselves after that with the particular richness of a life well constructed. Thomas grew into a boy who was better with horses than anyone who had not been raised among them could understand, and who learned to read with a ferocious appetite that matched his mother's. Clara grew into a girl who was interested in everything and afraid of very little, and who had her father's steady quality and her mother's way of looking at a problem from the angle no one else had considered. They hired more hands as the breeding operation grew. Eli, who had stayed on, became in time less an employee than an essential part of the place, and his knowledge of the horses was something Hugh relied on and respected explicitly. Louise kept the books for the breeding operation, and gradually, by reputation and word of mouth, became a resource for other ranching families in the area who needed help making their own numbers work. She charged modestly and helped generously, and built over the years a network of relationships that gave the Walden family a kind of standing in the community that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the simple currency of being people who could be counted on. Dusty Creek itself changed, as small towns did in those decades when the West was being organized and incorporated. The railroad had established a proper station. A school had been built, a real one with a dedicated school teacher. The saloon had been joined by a second, which the minister viewed with alarm and the rest of the town viewed with equanimity. New families arrived and old ones moved on, and the town was always in the process of becoming something, as towns in that country were. The broken spur endured through all of it, the fence lines that Hugh had fought to hold now expanding slightly, as he purchased an additional 40 acres to the south from a family that was moving further west. The horses were the heart of the operation in every sense, the breeding records that Louise maintained showing a bloodline developing over years into something distinctive and sought after, animals that combined the best qualities of the wild and the domestic in a way that cattlemen trusted and riders loved. Hugh turned 40 in 1885, and Louise organized a celebration that brought Cody and Annie and their 3 children, and Eli and a number of the neighboring families, and the old minister who had stayed in Dusty Creek long enough to become genuinely fond of it, and they filled the new porch and spilled into the yard, and Thomas, now 10 years old, gave a toast in his father's honor that was so earnest and so accurate and so loving that even Hugh had to look away for a moment and find something very interesting to examine about the middle distance. "You have something to say?" Louise asked him quietly, standing beside him while the party went on around them. "Just that I did not expect any of this," he said. "Any of what?" "All of it," he said. "The ranch, the children, you especially." He looked at her, 40 years old and still with those Autumn Creek eyes that had stopped her hands on the shelf all those years ago. "I came here to build something, and I did, but I did not know it was going to be this. I did not know it was possible to be this lucky." She took his arm and leaned against him and looked out at their children running in the yard and their friends gathered on their porch, and the plains going on forever in the evening light beyond the fence, and she said, "You built good ground. I just helped plant things." "You did more than that," he said. "We did more than that," she corrected. He put his arm around her, and they stood together in the September evening of his 40th year. And it was, in all the ways that counted, a beginning as much as it was a marking of time, the beginning of the next portion of a life that had already been so much more than either of them had known to want. The broken spur ran on into the years that followed with the quiet momentum of something built to last. The horses continued to be the pride of it, and by the late 1880s, the Walden bloodline was referenced by buyers across Texas and into New Mexico as a standard of what a working horse could be when bred with patience and intention. Thomas, growing into his late teens, was becoming what anyone watching him closely had suspected he would become, a horseman of genuine distinction, with a feel for the animals that went beyond technique into something more instinctive. Clara, at 8 and then 10 and then 12, proved to be an extraordinary student, devouring every book that came through the school, and then coming home to find more in her parents' collection. And Louise watched her daughter's mind at work with a particular mixture of joy and recognition, seeing in her the same quality of ordered, relentless intelligence that she had always tried to put to use and had not always been permitted to. She made sure Clara was permitted. There were conversations about it, practical and also important, and Louise had them directly, because she had never found any method superior to directness. She told Clara, when Clara was 10 and already wrestling with the question of what a girl in that time and place was expected to want, that expectations were things that could be examined and sometimes revised by the people holding them. "You will have to decide for yourself what you are willing to accept," Louise told her, and Clara looked at her with those serious, large eyes and said, "What did you accept?" "Less than I should have at first," Louise said honestly. "And then I stopped." Clara nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to her book. Hugh, when told about this conversation, was quiet for a moment and then said, "She is exactly like you." "She is better than me," Louise said. "Impossible," he said simply. In the last years of the century's 9th decade, as the 1880s moved toward their close, Dusty Creek had become a different kind of place than the town Louise had stepped into in 1873. It was more settled, more organized, with a civic life and a school board and disputes that were conducted in courtrooms rather than at fence lines. The wildness had not gone entirely. That was not the nature of the country, but it had been folded into something that accommodated daily life more comfortably than it once had. There were still droughts and hard winters and cattle losses, and the thousand difficulties of working land in that climate. But there was also the infrastructure of a community that had decided to stay, and to make of the staying something worth having. Hugh and Louise were part of that community in ways that felt organic and unperformed. They attended the civic meetings and the church services, and the occasional social with the same ease they had developed in the early days, comfortable in the life they had built and generous with it, in the way of people who had been given much and knew it. One evening in the spring of 1889, Louise sat at the kitchen table after supper with the breeding records open before her and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow, and Hugh came in from the barn and sat down across from her and looked at her for a moment in the lamplight. "What?" she asked, because she knew his faces. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She shook her head slightly, fond and unsentimental. "You were just looking," she repeated. "You are the finest thing that ever happened to this ranch," he said. "I am the finest thing that happened to the records of this ranch," she said. "The ranch you built." "Louise." She looked up at him. He was leaning on the table with both forearms, which was the posture of a man who wanted to be taken seriously, and his face held the same directness it always had, no less than the first time she had seen it in that store doorway, only deeper now, all that steadiness run further in. "I mean it," he said. "You know I mean it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, gently and with everything she had, "I know." She reached across the table and turned her hand palm up, and he put his hand in hers, and they sat there together in the old, easy intimacy of two people who have long since given up the performance of love and arrived at the thing itself, the real and daily thing, ongoing and unglamorous and completely sufficient. Thomas married in 1893, a quiet ceremony in the Dusty Creek Church with a young woman named Rose Alderman, who had come with her family from Kansas, and who had a gift for the horses that Thomas had recognized before he had recognized anything else about her, which Louise considered a reliable indicator of his priorities and found entirely appropriate. They settled on a portion of the Broken Spur's expanded acreage, building a small house on the south end that Hugh and Thomas and Eli constructed together over a summer, and the property became a kind of compound of family rather than a single household, with grandchildren becoming a real rather than theoretical feature of the horizon. Clara, at 18, was sharp and purposeful and had written letters to a school in San Antonio that had recently begun accepting women as students in their teaching program. And when the acceptance came, Louise and Hugh drove her to the stage together and stood watching it leave with the particular emotion of parents who are simultaneously proud and quietly bereft and would not have it any other way. "She will be all right," Hugh said, more to himself than to Louise. "She will be extraordinary," Louise said, with the confidence of someone who had watched the evidence accumulate for 18 years. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together at the edge of the road until the dust settled, and then they turned and walked back to the wagon and drove home through the spring afternoon of the Texas plains, the same road she had first seen from a stagecoach window 20 years ago, the same sky overhead that had been the color of a bruise the day she arrived, now clear and blue and full of exactly the kind of light that made you understand why people stayed. The Broken Spur went on. It would go on longer than either of them would see, in the hands of Thomas and Rose and the children they would have, and in the spirit of the records Louise had kept and the bloodline Hugh had built, and in the particular way of things made with genuine love, which is the most durable building material there is. But that evening, with the spring still warm around them and the horses moving in the pasture and Thomas and Rose working their end of the property, and a letter from Clara still on its way from San Antonio, Hugh and Louise sat on the long south porch in the last of the light, and were simply there. In the life they had made together from the scratch and clay of a hard country, and a chance encounter in a general store, and two people who had been brave enough to stop running from the possibility of belonging somewhere. The stars came out over the plains in their extravagant numbers, and the coyotes made their night arrangements out on the flats, and the horses settled in the dark of the pasture, and Louise leaned her head against Hugh's shoulder and felt the steady beat of him beside her and thought, as she often thought in moments like this, of the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach with $4.30 and a carpet bag and a chin lifted against the whole frontier, and what she had been looking for, and what she had found, which was so much more than she had known to look for, that the distance between the wanting and the having seemed from here almost comic. "Hugh," she said. "Yes. I am glad the next coach wasn't for 2 weeks." He made a sound that was a laugh and also more than a laugh, and he put his arm around her and pulled her closer, and they sat together in the evening of the life they had built and the years they had shared and the love that had grown between them like the best things grow, slowly and with root, and with the kind of depth that no weather gets all the way through, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything there was. The plains went on around them as they always did, indifferent and enormous and beautiful, and the Broken Spur sat in the middle of them steady as anything. And the two people on the porch had nothing left unresolved between them, nothing left unspoken, nothing left that wasn't as settled and solid and real as the ground beneath their feet, which Hugh Walden had built on and Louise Easton had chosen, and which belonged to them both in every way that mattered. It was enough. It was, without question, exactly enough.